Hi, my name is Riccardo Manzotti. I'm an Italian philosopher and I've been working on consciousness for at least 20 years. I've also been working on artificial intelligence, artificial vision, AI, perception, and the psychology of perception. I've been really interested about what is consciousness and how can we find consciousness in the physical world. I'm a physicalist and I believe I find a rather interesting solution, a hypothesis that I call the mind-object identity, or the spread mind, which is basically the idea that our conscious experience is not an addition to the physical world. It is rather the physical world itself, taking place relative to our body. I believe that whenever we have an experience of an object, whenever we see, we hear, we taste, we touch something, that's because at that very time we are that something. We are not a brain that has an experience of the world. Neither are we a soul peering at the physical world by means of mental representation. I believe that we are the external world itself, and that the body is a proxy of such a physical world. Actually, if you think about our experience, I claim that we've never seen our experience as experience. Whenever we think about our existence, what we find is the world itself. If we peer inside ourselves, as it is usually suggested to do by psychologists, we are immediately in the external world. We are immediately in a world that is made of the world itself. All the properties that populate our existence are properties that we find in the physical world, are properties of objects, are things that happen, bodies, colors, shapes. Everything is there. And I believe it's much easier to explain what we are if we start from the assumption that we are not separate from the external world, but that we are there, we are not here. I'm not behind my eyes. I'm there. I'm, at this very moment, the camera that is recording this video, or the marble lion in my back, or the wall at my back, or the trees in my background. At any time, I am the world that happens to be the stuff my experience is made of. My experience is not made by mental stuff. Nobody has ever found mental stuff inside the brain. I believe that this search for consciousness inside the brain is nothing better than the search for ether in 19th century. Something that does not exist. Something that we have invented only to safeguard our wrong assumption about reality. One assumption is that we are separate from the world. The other assumption is that we are either an immaterial mind that nobody has ever found, or a neural process with some special properties. But we know that neural processes have no special properties. They're wonderful stuff. This is a brain. They do wonderful things. But they're just what they are, like everything else in the physical world. Namely, they're neurons. They produce substances. They produce neurotransmitters. They require blood, oxygen. And they are clearly a wonderful machine. But there's no evidence that such neurons may produce anything like our experience. There's no evidence that they might produce anything like the world that is our existence. My approach is very simple. It's so simple that you may be baffled, that you may think that this theory cannot be true because it's just too simple. And because scientists have been looking for consciousness for hundreds of years, the solution could not have been in front of everyone. But sometimes people have been just too smart. And they have been looking for something too difficult, while the solution was just there, in front of their nose. And the solution is that our conscious experience of the world is nothing but the world. So whenever I perceive an object, let me use my favorite object, the red apple, what's closer to my experience of the red object, of the red apple, than the red apple itself? This is much better than the brain. Physically speaking, my experience of the red apple right now is just red, round and shiny. And there's nothing red, round and shiny in the brain. So, if scientists went to such a great length to explain how could the brain have anything like my red, round and shiny experience of the apple, why didn't they take into consideration the much easier solution? Namely that whenever I have an experience of a red, round and shiny apple, the thing that I am is the red, round and shiny apple. Why is that so difficult to accept? It is too difficult to accept because we moved from the idea that we are separate from the world that we perceive. And there are many reasons to move from such an assumption. They are just assumptions. The strongest objection to my theory is that we all have an experience of a different apple. So each of us has a slightly different apple, and because of that, many people felt the need to introduce the idea of a subjective layer. Namely, a layer where each of us is able to produce his or her own personal apple. And that's the basis of the Western philosophy. The idea that there's an objective physical world which is the same for everyone, and then there are as many subjective, mental, inner world for each of us. The world of our consciousness, where our brain or our soul or our mind creates a personal, private reality, different for each of us. But this objection is weak. Why it is weak? It is weak because the physical world is not like that. And we know that ever since Galileo in 1632, when he wrote his dialogues that were the foundation of modern science. But we haven't taken his analysis of the physical world seriously enough. So basically, the hypothesis of Galileo, which is still the foundation of science, is that every physical property is a relative physical property. Consider weight, or velocity, or color. Are they absolute? No. They depend on their reference frame. In the case of velocity, the dependence on with a reference frame is super easy. Velocity doesn't exist in any absolute sense. The velocity of an object is what it is, always relative on another object, or a reference frame. But the same holds true for all other physical properties that we find in our experience. Take weight, for example. Weight depends on the mass of the planet on which you stand. So, here on the Earth, I weigh roughly 95 kilos. On the Moon, I would weigh a much better 16 kilos. On Jupiter, I would weigh 300 kilos. More or less, give or take. So weight is relative to, and also colors. They're relative to the photoreceptors you have, to their kinds, to the way they work. And I could go on forever to show that all properties, temperature, velocity, as we take place in our world, in our existence, not as they are defined by physicists, but as they take place as entities in our existence, they are relative properties. But are they relative to what? They are relative to our natural reference frame, which is our body. So our body has a double role. It is both the proxy of a world, the world that does things because of our body, and they have the role of a causal reference frame, relative to which a whole world takes place. And this whole world, which is not a mental world, which is not inside my brain or inside my mind, but which is there, is the thing or the collection of things that we have traditionally called our conscious mind. But there's no need to have a conscious mind as something different from the physical world. There is just the physical world, which is one with everything we have ever found in our experience. So we need no longer the notion of experience. We need no longer the notion of a subjective layer where each of us concocts a private world. We have just umpteen relative worlds, which are different because, of course, each of them takes place relative to our own body. And because each of us has a different body, each of us will have a different relative world, which will be outside, which will be all around our body, not inside our brain. By doing that, the spread mind, or the mind-object identity theory, is very similar to neuroscientists, only that it suggests a different object. After all, a neuroscientist is, or should be, a physicalist, namely someone who tries to explain a phenomenon, in this case consciousness, by means of another phenomenon that, being a physicalist, should be a physical phenomenon. So, neuroscientists have tried to find inside the brain, inside the central nervous system, some phenomenon that may be identical to our experience. And in the 50s and in the 60s, they called such an approach the mind-object identity theory. Unfortunately, they didn't find anything like our experience. So they withdraw to other solutions that are weaker, but in the end they're always looking for something that should be the very thing that is our experience. But they have not been able to find anything. So, if there is one thing that neuroscientists have been able to demonstrate so far, is that inside the central nervous system there isn't anything like our experience of the world. The mind-object identity follows these steps, namely, looks for something physical that should be identical with our experience, and finds such a thing not inside the body, but in the physical world surrounding our body and taking place all the time around our body. So what's better than shifting from the notion of experience of the world to the notion of the existence of the world? Using William James' words, I would say that we don't live in a world of pure experience. We live in a world of pure existence. To have an experience of something is simply to be that something. So, to solve the problem of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, we need to get a better understanding of the physical world in terms of relative properties. Once we do that, we will find everything we have associated with consciousness in the physical world. And there will be no need to look for any emergent property in the brain. No need to look inside us. But we will be able just to find ourselves in the world. That will be astonishing, because we will finally get rid of the subjective versus objective dichotomy. We will no longer need a subjective reality as opposed to the objective reality of the world. We will only have relative existence, but not relative to a subject, which would be just like the old subjectivity, we will just need relative to another object. So we will have a pure object ontology, and we will just be a collection of such objects inside such a reality. So the solution that I propose is super simple. It reduces everything to relative objects. Relative objects that take place in the physical world, relative to our bodies. In conclusion, I may say that I am neither a soul nor a brain. I am a world that takes place relative to our body. So finally, I can understand why I've never found myself comfortable in accepting the identity with my brain or with my body, because it's wrong to claim that we are a brain or that we are a body. We have a body, and it is fundamental to have a body, because the body is the necessary condition for the taking place of the collection of relative objects, which is the relative world, which is the thing that has always been called the conscious mind. So, where am I? I'm not behind my eyes. I'm not inside this head. I am in front of my body right now, or around my body, if I take into consideration what I hear. I am one with the world, and everything I find in my experience is just a relative object, or the relative property of a relative object, taking place relative to my body. To explain our existence, we don't need a subjective world. That is an anthropomorphic approach to draw a conclusion. I am neither a brain nor a soul. I am a physical world taking place relative to my body, which is both the proxy and the causal reference frame of such a physical world. When you look at me, you don't see me. You see my body. You see a proxy. I'm not this thing. I am everything that is now able to produce effects by means of this thing. But this is just a thing. And this doesn't mean that I am a soul, that I am a spirit, that I'm not physical. On the contrary, I am extremely physical. In fact, I'm able to move this body in all possible ways. But this body is just like a cell phone. When you speak to a cell phone, you don't speak with the cell phone. You speak with somebody which is producing effects by means of that cell phone. Right now, you are speaking with a world that is made of umpteen things here in Italy, in Boston, in Milan, in California, in Berlin, in Germany, in England, in everywhere I've been. A body that is made of things, though. Other people's bodies, mountains, clouds, sun. And all combined together, they're able to make things happen by means of my body. So right now you're speaking with a world. I am that world. I am not this body. And the mind-object identity explains how you can find yourself in the physical world. If you want to know more about this theory, you can have a look at my website, www.riccardomanzotti.com, or read my book, The Spread Mind, by OR Books. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Garrett Mindt. I'm the Elizabeth Koch Research Fellow for the Tiny Blue Dot Foundation for Consciousness Studies. I'm based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today I'll be talking about developing a new neutral monism. This is the result of, it's the last essay in a dissertation I just defended last fall. And I'm hoping to give sort of a sketch of what I take to be a sort of new neutral monism. This is coming from considerations in the dissertation on the philosophical foundations of integrated information theory. So just to go over the plan for the talk, first I'm going to start out with some of the motivations to explain the background for coming up with a new neutral monism. Then I want to give out some preliminary assumptions that I use to get the metaphysics off the ground. I'll then talk a bit about two different perspectives on metaphysics, one being information-theoretic neutral monism, primarily from Kenneth Sayre, 1976, and information-theoretic structural realism from Lademan et al. In 2007. Once this has been done, I take the conjunction of these two views and I give what I call information-theoretic neutral structuralism. I want to then just explain that view very briefly before then moving on to giving some open questions and problems, worries, concerns. So just to briefly go over some of the motivations for developing a new neutral monism. Through the dissertation, I wanted to develop metaphysics of consciousness, which sort of helps to unify our picture of reality, one which can also elucidate consciousness's place in nature, and ultimately develop a metaphysics that avoids or overcomes the structured dynamics argument, Chalmers 2003, and by extension, the hard problem, Chalmers 1995-96. I came from the developing this metaphysics, I came from working on the philosophical foundations of integrated information theory of consciousness, or IAT, developed by Giulio Tononi and his colleagues at the Wisconsin Institute for Sleep and Consciousness. One of the reasons for looking at IAT is IAT doesn't fall strictly into sort of the classic pictures that we have of the metaphysics of consciousness, say dualism or physicalism or idealism. And then I wanted to look at neutral monism because it seemed like a strong contender for a metaphysics that could ultimately unify a picture of reality, that obviously coming from the motivations in the early 20th century for developing neutral monism in the first place. Now, before we get started, I just want to give the kind of three assumptions that fall out from the previous essays in the dissertation. The current talk is based on the last essay, which sort of gives this rough sketch of a new neutral monism. So the three assumptions that sort of fall out are one, phenomenal realism. So phenomenal states and properties are real insofar as they are real properties of the natural world, say not illusions, for example. The second assumption is structural realism. So our best scientific theories reveal the structural features of reality, and our best theories show us a structure that exists out in the natural world. So I'm a realist about those structural properties. And then third and final is informational realism. So information is a real objective feature of reality insofar as it's not merely an abstraction from mental states or some observer-dependent property. Now, before we go into the details of how we get to the neutral monism that I want to develop, I just want to give the statement of what the view is, so that way you can keep it in your mind as the talk progresses. So I'll just read it out quickly. So information-theoretic neutral structuralism. So information is a mind-independent feature of reality, not merely an abstraction from or as a result of physical and or mental properties, processes, or relationships. It is a distinct ontological category, one which is prior to those properties, processes, or relationships, which we use the concepts physical and mental to describe. This nature is revealed through the structural relationships we discover in our natural investigations of the world, which point to patterns of informational structures. Put another way, following Russell, information is the common ancestor, neutral but prior. So why neutral monism in the first place? So motivations in the early 20th century discussions of metaphysics, materialism seemed to leave no place for the mind and consciousness in our picture of the natural world. You might see Russell's criticism of physicalism or materialism. And then dualism seems to leave a schism in our picture of reality, because it doesn't seem like there's a direct connection or an entailment between physical properties and, say, mental or conscious properties. With neutral monism, positing a neutral entity may mend the divide between the mind and body, mind and matter, physical and consciousness. Take whichever dichotomy you want. The point is that perhaps if we find this common ancestor, which Bertrand Russell called a neutral entity in his neutral monism, then maybe we can begin to divide this seeming divide in nature. So I wanted to start by giving Russell's neutral monism, just as a background. And as Russell says, the stuff of which the world of our experience is composed is, in my belief, neither mind nor matter, but something more primitive than either. Both mind and matter seem to be composite, and the stuff of which they are compounded lies in a sense between the two, in a sense above them both, like a common ancestor. Now, with Russell's neutral monism, and I don't want to go too much into detail about Russell's own neutral monism, Russell posits what he calls sensibilia as the neutral entity. Now, one of the problems with Russell's neutral entity, sensibilia, is what kind of explanatory work it actually does in its neutral monism. One of the problems, and this is a criticism that we'll go over when we talk about kind of Sayre's information-theoretic neutral monism, is that to do any sort of explanatory work, which was supposed to be the point of neutral monism, to unify in the natural sciences, one must translate sensibilia into physical or mental concepts, essentially rendering it impotent in terms of explanatory power. So as Sayre's criticism goes, despite the ontological and methodological priority that might be claimed for the neutral framework, it is sterile for the explanation of actual phenomenon and hence parasitical upon existing theoretical structures. It is no cause for wonder why physicists and psychologists, among others, have not taken neutral monism seriously, despite its express purpose of clarifying the foundations of the sciences in question. So now, information-theoretic neutral monism, as Sayre says, is the view that information is the neutral and fundamental entity, property, process of reality. Now, the notion of information which Sayre utilizes is that of Claude Shannon's from 1953, is this notion of the reduction of uncertainty. A part of the problem maybe with Sayre's information-theoretic neutral monism is that given that it's relatively recent historically in terms of applying information theory in various sciences, is that it doesn't give a complete picture about what the role of information is, what the precise definition of information is that's being used as a neutral entity. He more was doing precisely what I want to do now, which is posit information as the neutral entity and see if better explanation about how to unify different levels of organization, sciences that specifically look at those, into a broader ontology. Sayre argues that the physical and the mental are concepts which are essentially abstractions from this neutral entity, and ultimately Sayre thinks that positing information as a neutral entity better explains the relationship between, say, physics and higher order phenomena such as psychology and biology, etc. Now, since information-theoretic neutral monism is sort of the first half of the conjunction of the two, which I use to develop the neutral monism I give at the end, information-theoretic structural realism being the second, I just want to go over briefly what structural realism is, just to give a better idea of what that is. So, structural realism, we should only permit those entities into our ontology which figure into our best scientific practices. So, to kind of give a motivation behind the spirit behind structural realism, as Worrell put it in 1989, he, speaking of the structural realist, insists that it is a mistake to think that we can ever understand the nature of the basic furniture of the universe. Nonetheless, structural realism defers to our best scientific practices and theories for what we should allow into our ontology. Now, the point of that just being is that whatever structural properties our best scientific theories tell us, we should just admit that that is our best guide to the nature of reality. So structural realism just takes that perspective on what we can say about so the nature of, say, the fundamental ontology that builds things up. Now, you might be saying, hold up at this point. Didn't you start by saying you want to posit information as a neutral entity? Doesn't that entail understanding the nature of the furniture of reality? Doesn't that sort of violate the spirit behind structural realism? And I think understanding the nature of the fundamental entity and positing one as a likely candidate are two very different things. So by no means do I want to say that by positing information as the neutral entity in our neutral monism, does that mean we fully understand it? It's merely that as a result of our best scientific practices, more and more it seems clear that there is sort of this pervasive notion of information that exists across, say, different levels of complexity, different scales of organization, and by abduction, perhaps it's best to posit that as our kind of ontological base. So, in a sense, I'm taking more of a pragmatic stance by positing information as the neutral entity. And the point being is that, if we posit it as the neutral entity, and we are able to get a better picture of how to bridge the schism between mind and matter, then we have a prevailing reason to adopt that neutral entity as what Russell calls the common ancestor. Now there's kind of two flavors of structural realism. There's sort of the epistemic structural realism, which is the nature of the structural relations are epistemic features of our explanations of the natural world, not indicative of some ontological features out there in reality. So put another way, the structural features given to us by our best scientific picture of reality aren't sort of the true structure of reality. Conversely, there's the ontological form of structural realism. So the nature of structural relations are a glimpse into the ontological features of reality, and are not merely abstractions or artifacts of our best scientific explanations or theories. So put another way, the structural features given to us by our best scientific picture of reality is the true structure of reality. Now, obviously, you can accommodate this through things like theory change, since you just merely update that, well, those structural features we previously thought in our best theories led us to our new the new structural features that we discovered through updating and theory change. Now, the form of structural realism that I'll be adopting, from my view, is ontic structural realism, specifically information-theoretic structural realism, as argued by Lademan et al. 2007. So information structural realism is the conjunction of structural realism and what Lademan and his co-authors call rainforest realism. So rainforest realism is meant to capture the scale relativity of ontology. So in that, there are a number of scales at which scientific investigations take place across the special sciences, and those are no less or more greater, ontologically speaking, than, say, the scale of physics. Ultimately, Lademan and his co-authors in their information-theoretic structural realism do defer to physics in that, so any sort of causal explanation, say, you might give in the special sciences, not the scale of physics, has to be in line with what our best physical theories tell us about the world. So saying so, ITSR is meant to capture that, one, our best scientific theories are explanations that reveal structural features of nature, and that, two, the various scales at which our investigations take place are always ontologically real in the sense that they pick out real patterns, a la Dennett, 1989, of reality. So just to give briefly what Lademan says about ITSR, according to ITSR, tables and chairs are real patterns. They just do not have fundamental counterparts at the fundamental level, where all proper talk about entities whose status fueled 20th century scientific reality debate goes on. Reliance on the notional world idea of cohesive things is just completely misleading. ITSR explains why parochial causal concepts are robust in special sciences, but also why nothing stronger than a thin notion of lower process unifies them. So, based on ITSR, we may not get directly at the nature of the basic furniture of reality, but we do get clues, and these clues allow us to extrapolate and speculate about what the nature of reality is. If one adopts OSR, then we must take as a consequence that the character of the structural features we discover is indicative of the true nature of reality. But how do we kind of get from ITSR from the structural features of reality? So given that our scientific investigations information-theoretic character and the scale irrelativity of information, as argued by Lademan, Sayre, to Luciano Floridi in his form of informational structural realism, because information is this ubiquitous notion across levels of organization in the sciences, I just think it's worth exploring what it might mean to have an informational ontology. So instead of constantly translating our, say, information-theoretic explanations of the world into physical or mental concepts, what if we just take that as the sort of fundamental ontological entity? So just to kind of go over what we did, we first began by sort of introducing neutral monism and Sayre's information-theoretic neutral monism, and then moved on to introducing structural realism and Lademan et al.'s information-theoretic structural realism. Now all that is left is to kind of give the conjunction of these two views for what I think is a novel kind of metaphysics of consciousness, information-theoretic neutral structuralism. So I think that what happens as a result of the conjunction of these two views leads us to a kind of strong commitment to, one, our natural investigations revealing the informational structure of the world, as expressed by ITSR, and two, that the nature of the underlying features of reality that our investigations are about is information-theoretic, as expressed by information-theoretic neutral monism. So in developing the information-theoretic neutral monism and the information-theoretic structural realism from Sayre and Lademan, respectively, the notion of information which they utilize is Shannon's notion of information. So from his kind of seminal work in the mathematical theory of communication, 1953, which has to do with the notion of reduction of uncertainty. So it's kind of the foundations for information theory. Now in the dissertation, I explored sort of the issues with using classic extant notions of information in terms of explaining consciousness, and what good they do and what harm they do in terms of giving a information-theoretic explanation of consciousness. Now, obviously connected to Chalmers' hard problem in terms of, at the end of his book, speculating about the nature of information and how it relates to consciousness. With considerations from integrated information theory and discussions that happened previously in the dissertation before the current essay, I kind of give a rough notion of information which I think is at play in the neutral monism that I try to develop. So I define information sort of tentatively as a unique n-dimensional structure or shape in an abstract space of possibilities, which uniformly increases as novelty increases. The more unique or novel the shape, structure, or process, the more information contained in that structure, shape, or process. So in this sense, I'm trying to give a sort of general notion of information which might fit in with other extant notions, but nonetheless might be able to play a role as this neutral entity. And just to restate what I take the conjunction of these two positions to entail, information is a mind-independent feature of reality, not merely an abstraction from or as a result of physical and/or mental properties, processes, relationships. It is a distinct ontological category, one which is prior to those properties, processes, relationships, which we use the concepts physical and mental to describe. The nature is revealed through the structural relationships we discover in our natural investigations of the world, which point to patterns of informational structures. Put another way, following Russell, information is the common ancestor, neutral but prior. So I just want to end by kind of giving some sort of problems or concerns that might have popped up. They popped up for me, so they probably popped up for you. One of them is there kind of a unifying notion of information that can serve as a foundation for one's ontology? And I tried to give a sort of rough characterization of how I think one should understand information in the context of information-theoretic neutral structuralism. But you might think maybe something more like Luciano Floridi's general definition of information. There isn't quite yet this sort of unified notion of information, and any textbook on information theory starts out with that kind of vaguely philosophical chapter, which is, we have these sort of disparate extant notions of information, how to measure it, but we don't have a sort of unified picture of what information is. And part of the project, I think, of speculating about information being in an information-theoretic neutral monism is getting to that kind of unified picture of information and how that relates to our ontology in general. Further questions: how does one translate physical and mental concepts smoothly from information-theoretic concepts? And I think Sayre in his book does a great job of explaining how to understand physical processes in an information-theoretic way. You also might think sort of holographic interpretations of quantum mechanics has an information-theoretic character. And more you see information theory playing a role, say in studying consciousness and these types of things. I think that just gives us good reason to suspect that there's some relation between information and these sort of prevalent physical and mental concepts that we utilize. So another question, how does this view mesh with our understanding of levels of organization and the supposed primacy of physics? One of the interesting things about neutral monism is that the idea is supposed to be to develop an ontology which unifies all the natural sciences. I mean, Sayre's criticism of Russell was that his neutral monism was impotent in doing just this, and that has to be the point of a neutral monism. And given the prevalence of information-theoretic concepts across our levels of organization, and in physics especially, it seems like an ontological entity that could play that role. And then furthermore, the last question, does metaphysics solve the hard problem or the mind-body problem, however you want to put it? In my dissertation, I try to argue that it does. Obviously, in the 20-minute talk, I wasn't able to motivate that too much, but perhaps we could talk about it in the discussion. So thank you. And if anyone's interested, the full paper goes into much more detail about how I get to the position. So if anyone's interested, please email me. I'd be happy to share. And thank you for taking the time to listen to this talk.
My name is Roger Schriner, and I've been an independent scholar in philosophy of mind for 28 years. I'll be reading my paper and showing a few key passages on the screen. One of my interests has been a puzzle that Joseph Levine calls the problem of duality. It might also be called the paradox of self-intimation. Conscious experiences seem to have a dual character, so that the very same state is both cognitive apprehension and object of cognitive apprehension. This suggests a paradoxical sort of self-intimation, a form of self-knowledge, in which an experience and our introspection-based knowledge of that experience are the same mental state. So that's the problem of duality. Of course, duality is not the same issue as dualism, and I'll be saying a little bit about dualism later on. It would surely be strange if something was literally aware of itself, so that its being in state S at time t constituted an awareness of the exact same state S at time t. It would then be self-knowing, self-intimating in a way that seems ontologically peculiar. By ontologically peculiar, I mean it would seem to have a strange sort of ultimate nature that we do not comprehend. This sort of ontological weirdness would undermine the physicalist idea that consciousness consists of plain, old, physical matter. I have maintained that self-intimation is an illusion. One motivation for this illusory idea is the fact that we seem to know our experiences just as they occur, so that being in a mental state and knowing about this state occur simultaneously, and I actually agree with this claim. It is highly plausible that in some ways we do know our experiences at the very time they occur. But this instantaneous self-knowledge can be explained in terms that fit physicalism and without accepting self-intimation. This paper explains how that can be so. One way to understand the instantaneous knowledge of our own experiences involves what I will call simultaneous conceptual annotations, or simply annotations. Many of our thoughts and other conscious conceptual states comment on our experiences, and some of these conscious conceptions occur at essentially the same time as the experiences to which they refer. They are like annotations, explanatory notes that comment on nearby text. It's now widely agreed that experiences are generated through unconscious processes before they become conscious. So while a sensory perceptual experience is still in its preconscious preparatory stage, cognitive processes might already be gathering information from this budding perceptual state, developing cognitions about it based on this unconscious access. Notice that if cognitive processes had no contact with preconscious sensory states, it would be hard to explain how our conscious attention is automatically directed to certain aspects of our perceptions based on how they're related to our interests. Attention often shifts to something important before we consciously realize its importance. It should be possible then for the following states to occur simultaneously. First, a conscious sensory state S that occurs at time t. Second, a conscious cognition C at time t that conceptualizes some feature of S. C is an annotation. It is conscious, it comments on a current experience, and it occurs at roughly the same time as that experience. The examples that I'm going to offer are mostly perceptions of the world around us, and I consider these to be internal experiences. So let me say about internalism versus externalism, which locates experience in the outside world. As I see it, our experiences do not announce their own location, internal or external. The reason it seems obvious that sensory experiences are of things outside of us is that we're hardwired to construe them that way. Taking perceptual experiences to be objects and regions in the world is an automatic construal, a conceptualization, not something that's dictated by the perceptual states themselves. And I now believe that when we automatically treat perceptions as outside of us, that is not genuine externalism. To see what I mean, think about animals. Animals don't have the intellectual ability to think of experiences as states of their own minds. So by default, they have to be externalists about their perceptions. But I now realize that this sort of externalism is contingent. Their minds have evolved to treat sensory experiences as external when that is appropriate, and to suspend externalism when it's not appropriate. An antelope sees a tiger, then it looks away. It does not suppose the tiger has vanished. So it does not literally consider the perception of the tiger to be the tiger and wonder where it went. Or the antelope looks at a tree in the jungle and then shifts its visual attention to a pile of rocks, so that now it only sees the tree through peripheral vision, which of course is relatively fuzzy. But it does not think that some finely detailed features of the tree were there for a moment and then disappeared when it looked at the rocks. Humans are also natural externalists about veridical perceptions, but I now believe we too are natural externalists contingently, conditionally. And unlike the antelope, we can realize that contingent externalism suggests an internalist view of consciousness. Okay, I'm now going to mention 7 kinds of annotations that may co-occur with sensory experiences, and I welcome additional suggestions. First is objects. Objects are annotated in several ways. Most obviously, we often simultaneously perceive an object and recognize its identity, as if it were wearing an invisible name tag. We see things as known items rather than as clusters of shapes and colors. Seeing a wolf in the forest, one's visual perception of its shape and color might be assembled unconsciously at the same time that the annotation, wolf near tree, is unconsciously assembled. So let's call the experience of the wolf VW. I'll just move to the next slide here. And so we have several kinds of propositional attitude annotations that might be associated with VW, besides the obvious belief state that could be expressed by saying, that's a wolf. Wondering about VW is a different propositional attitude. Is that a wolf? Considering how to respond to VW. Climb a tree? Deciding how to respond to VW. Run to car. All of these external object annotations help create the impression that we know about a sensory experience at the very instant it occurs. thus reinforcing the idea that the sensory perception is its own apprehension. Moving on to the next kind of general example, properties. In addition to conscious cognitions about objects, we conceptualize an object's properties. And of course, there are many possible property concepts, only a few of which are going to be conscious at any given moment. Our thoughts about specific properties drift in and out of consciousness, depending on context and relevance to our interests. In carrying a sack, we may not be focally conscious of its perceived weight, but if suddenly the sack becomes much lighter, we may feel this new lightness and at the same time consciously realize that it might indicate a problem. Something fell out of the sack. Number 3 would be affordances. Tom McClellan, drawing on the work of J.J. Gibson, has argued persuasively that we are conscious of affordances, the potentialities inherent in the world around us. Every object we perceive affords us possibilities for action, and we experience these potentialities. For example, McClellan suggested in perceiving a teapot, we also perceive the possibility of picking it up. Objects afford an almost endless range of uses, only a few of which enter consciousness at any one time. Without arguing the point here, I contend that being conscious of affordance is a conceptual rather than a perceptual experience. And if an object and a concept about what it affords become conscious simultaneously, that is an annotation. Next, linguistic meanings. In previous work, I've emphasized our conscious awareness of linguistic meanings, such as your awareness of the meaning of the sentence. We could think of the experienced meanings of words as a series of conceptual commentaries on the sensory experience of seeing, hearing, or subvocalizing these words. However, we may want to differentiate the notion of commenting about sensory experiences from the idea of interpreting such symbols. Commenting about experienced sensory symbols from the notion of interpreting such symbols. The term annotation fits commenting better than it fits interpreting. We may also perceive ourselves carrying out actions and simultaneously knowing our behavioral objectives, what we're trying to do. I notice myself scrawling the address on an envelope. I then begin to write more legibly, simultaneously realizing my motivation. I want this to go to the right person. I know my behavioral objective just as it occurs. A sensory experience may also be accompanied by an awareness of evaluative considerations, its relevance to some sort of set of interests. This is good or bad. This is pleasing or displeasing. This is important or trivial. This is urgent. This is dangerous. And then finally, general categories. Many annotations characterize experiences or aspects of experiences quite broadly. For example, this is something in the external world. This is something in my mind. This is a dream or daydream or hallucination. This is a remembered or anticipated sensory state. This is a fantasized occurrence, such as the mental rehearsal of a physical movement. This is a visual experience or an experience of some other modality. Some co-occurring conceptions are so general that they apply to an entire experience, such as, this is an experience I'm having now. The self-referential term, this experience, might suggest self-intimation, but self-intimation requires both specificity and generality. It requires any and all concrete and introspectively accessible features of an experience to constitute their own subjective apprehension. Now, here are a few clarifications. I've been speaking of annotations as conscious cognitions, but why not just call them thoughts? Sometimes that would be appropriate, but the word thought suggests a cognition of which we are clearly and focally aware. Such thoughts generally occur after the experience itself. Furthermore, to call annotations thoughts might imply that we walk around explicitly thinking, that's a door, that's the doorknob, that's my hand reaching for the doorknob. Annotations tend to be conscious without being ostentatious. So the marginal note analogy of annotations seems fitting. One could contend that cognitions about sensory experiences are unconscious, but that does needless violence to ordinary concepts of consciousness. For one thing, it would require us to say that all day long, as we see objects, we're not conscious of their identities. I have been discussing annotations of sensory experiences, but conceptual experiences can be understood in much the same way. For example, if you become aware of doubting some statement in this paper, you may also become aware of the strength of your doubt. Your doubt is a conscious conceptual state. Your thought about the strength of that doubt is then conceptual state about another conceptual state. We've discussed annotations in relation to objects, properties, affordances, linguistic meanings, behavioral objectives, evaluative considerations, and general categories of experience. In combination, these examples suggest that we commonly know a great deal about our own experiences at the very moment these experiences occur. Consciousness is absolutely swarming with epistemic processes, including simultaneous conceptual annotations. Now, here's an idea that's related to simultaneous annotations. Introspection seems to show that each instant of consciousness has temporal thickness. Watching a moving object illustrates the point. If our brains are functioning normally, introspection seems to show the perception of motion as continuous rather than as a series of snapshots. Similarly, if we listen to a musical tone that lingers for a moment before it dies away, we do not just hear a sonic snapshot of the lingering tone. We hear the tone as lingering. We can usually detect something that is changing in every experienced instant, a small but temporally extended slice of mental activity. This is relevant to conceptual annotations because it gives the brain a little more leeway to sync up our experiences with seemingly instantaneous cognitions about these experiences. For example, if it was common for a visual experience of some object to slightly but noticeably precede our awareness of the object's identity, the effect might be similar to the disconcerting out-of-sync relationship between audio and video that is common in Zoom presentations. As I said earlier, the intuition that experiences apprehend themselves suggests that conscious phenomena are ontological mavericks. They're strange, we don't know what they are, and they surely can't be physical. But the concept of annotation discussed in this paper undermines this important objection to physicalism. We do not have to explain the apparent simultaneity of experiences and our knowledge of experiences by saying they are the same mental state. Actually, self-intimation is also hard to reconcile with at least some non-physicalist theories of consciousness, such as mind-body dualism. The duality problem, writes Joseph Levine, is really a problem about how there can be anything like conscious experience, which seems to require both unity and distinctness all at once. So self-intimation is not specifically a problem about understanding consciousness in material terms. It's a problem about understanding consciousness at all. In short, it is not deeply mysterious that we know a lot about our experiences just as they occur. We do not need self-intimation to account for instant self-knowledge. Conscious states come bundled with conceptual annotations. Now I will briefly show my contact information before ending this session, in case you want to get in touch, perhaps order the full copy of the paper, including footnotes. Thanks very much for your interests.
Hi there, my name is Mark Pharoah and I am an independent researcher based in London. The title of my presentation is From Biological Mechanism to Meaning. The main thrust of the presentation will be to indicate how and why qualitative subjective experience emerges from objectivity. A more thorough treatment is provided in a paper that was published in Biosemiotics Journal in 2018. The paper has now been translated into Russian for Method Journal. The presentation is in 3 parts. Part 1, the emergence and evolution of qualitative attribution. Part 2, the emergence of subjective phenomenal experience. And Part 3, the capacity to realize the existential self as a being in the world. Key concepts are discourse, ontologically distinct categories, biological meaning, emergence, and causation. So, Part 1, qualitative attribution. Even from a distance, there is something that makes Earth stand out from other planets. Physical properties such as electromagnetic waves, chemical signatures and vibrational frequencies have acquired properties of a unique and biological kind on Earth. Earth's atmospheres, seas and landscapes reflect the impact of this biological meaning. This is what makes Earth stand out from other planets. Now, the environment has undoubtedly influenced the evolution of species, but it is also evident that species have instigated changes in Earth's environments. In other words, it is a two-way evolving process. It is this lineage-environment interaction that has led to the progressive evolution of biological meaning from the mere physical. I call this lineage-environment interaction a form of discourse. Typically the term discourse is used in reference only to language, but I think of it much more broadly. I argue that discourse can be said to take place where any interactive mechanism creates meaning whose value is in some way justified. Replication is one such interactive mechanism. Replication facilitates a meaningful discourse with the environment, which takes place over a generational timeline. Due to this discourse over generations, there is a progressively meaningful correspondence between the evolving physiologies of a lineage and the environment. How might we understand the ontological nature of this meaningful biological environmental correspondence? There are 2 elements to answering this question. Firstly, due to replication, biochemical mechanisms tend to evolve that assimilate physical properties in qualitative terms. What this idea of qualitative ascription means is that physical properties tend to become increasingly differentiated in a way that has a bearing on their actual or potential marital value to the perpetuation of a replicating lineage. Second, biochemical mechanisms tend to reflect the relevance that qualitative ascriptions have on the individual in successfully perpetuating its lineage. Relevance therefore relates to such things as nutritional, restorative, functional, replicative demands and so on. Now, there are examples of environmental properties that bear a direct correspondence to some value ascription. For example, a biochemical mechanism might assimilate extremely high temperatures and subsequently instigate an innate recoil response. After all, there is an obvious benefit in creating distance from a harmful physical property. In such cases, there is a direct correspondence between temperature and its value to life forms. But there are many other physical properties that bear an indirect correspondence with their value to life forms. Examples include colours, smells, sounds, and so on. There is an indeterminacy of value to such physical properties, but their biochemical assimilation is still of obvious potential benefit. This indeterminacy of stimulus value is why we must combine both the qualitative and the relevancy elements, as follows. Due to a generational discourse, the biochemical assimilation of environmental particulars tends to evolve in a way that assigns a qualitative ascription whose merit or value can subsequently be qualified by the relevance that those ascriptions might or might not have on an individual's changing needs and survival demands. Now, if we consider the infinite range of possible stimulants of indeterminate absolute value, from every colour, hue and shade, to every scent, sensation, sound frequency, sound cluster, and amplitude, and so on, we might hypothesize that they all have cause to service a role in a complex qualitative array of varying and subtle biological characterization and description. I am of the view that this qualitative array in more sophisticated organisms is the foundation to the characterization of qualitative phenomenal content. Here, I would like to refer you to my paper for an extended argument. This means, of course, that the qualitative ascription to the physical is fundamentally biochemical and not neurological in foundation, and moreover must be present in the very simplest of life forms. Before the mechanism of replication existed on Earth, physical properties had no qualities. Replication has since led to the emergence of a novel ontological category with its own causal impetus. Physical properties have become properties with qualitative attributions. For those interested in emergentism, it is important to recognize that the emergent of interest is not life nor replication itself. Rather, the emergent of interest is the qualitative ascription to the physical. For those interested in causation, it is notable that a generational discourse subverts classical causal mechanics. It does this by moderating mere causal reaction through this newly acquired biologically ascribed meaning. Part 2, Phenomenal Experience. There are limitations to assimilating the physical world qualitatively. The individual creature itself is enslaved to the preordained physiological dispositions that have been handed down by its lineage. But the qualitative ascription of the physical does open the door to the possible emergence of novel capabilities. Neurons, for instance, can rapidly interconnect across distance and can attenuate and amplify biochemical imperatives. These capabilities can facilitate the rapid weighting of a creature's internal qualitative milieu and thereby moderate its motivational inclinations. This has two important consequences. Firstly, it sets in play an evaluative behavioural feedback. This feedback characterises a constantly changing real-time experiential discourse between the individual creature and its particular environment. Second, the process of continually evaluating a qualitatively assimilated world necessarily leads to the differentiation of the world according to the spatial and temporal placement of those changing qualitatively assimilated particulars. The process determines an interactive three-dimensional perspective of the world that constantly changes over time. In other words, the experienced world obtains a spatial and temporal frame of reference that is particular to the individual. Time and space as an experiential phenomenal ontology comes into existence for the first time in creatures whose neural mechanisms can rapidly weight and prioritize in real time the individual's qualitative assimilations of the environment. Another way of saying this is that such a creature possesses a constantly changing phenomenon of qualitatively delineated experiences. This phenomenon defines the boundaries of its particular subjective identity. Before sophisticated neural mechanisms existed, organism behaviour was determined solely by innate dispositions. Neural capabilities have since led to the emergence of a novel ontological category. Note, the emergent is not the neural mechanism itself. Rather, the emergent is the embedded subjective perspective, where the individual creature possesses its own individuated, spatio-temporal and qualitatively differentiated Umwelt. In relation to causation, it is notable that experiential evaluation has the potential to subvert both innate dispositions and classical causal mechanics. Part 3 being: evaluating a qualitatively assimilated world creates a subjective spatio-temporal and qualitative perspective that has boundaries. These boundaries confine the individual to the phenomenon of their subjective experience. Consequently, creatures with this subjective worldview communicate only to a level that reflects the significance, relevance and character of their experiential inclinations. There is no additional insight into the nature of their subjective experience, and therefore no inclination to communicate purposefully about any such insights. But in early hominid, a third novel ontological category began to emerge due to an increasingly sophisticated cognitive capability. This capability led to the abstraction of general principles about the rules governing the spatial, temporal and qualitative world of experience. As the complexity of abstracted principles evolve, the individual is committed to developing a comprehensive construct or proto-conceptual interpretation of reality. This evolving process engages an introspective conceptual discourse. One of the key consequences of this introspective conceptual discourse is that it evokes a sense of personal revelation. This revelation can be explained as follows. If an individual begins to conceive that the spatio-temporal world exists as a rule-bound factual and objective certainty, then that thinker unavoidably develops a conception concerning their own existential identity. The individual is provoked into considering that if it conceives of existence, it too must exist to be conceiving. This amounts to a subjective self-identification that inevitably characterizes the conception and belief in the individual's own existential being. Inevitably, when communicating, the individual will not merely express the unmoderated feelings that reflect the impact of experience, as do other animals, but additionally, the individual will be compelled to express its evolving conceptual interpretation of reality. In this endeavour, the individual human resolves to consider, express and refine the validity of its conceptualized worldview within its communities of influence. The third emergent ontological category is the revelatory conception of the existential self. Following the conceptualization of reality, introspective discourse, both in thought and in communication, has the potential to subvert associative learning, innate disposition, and classical causal mechanics. Looking at parts 1, 2 and 3 in their entirety, what we have is a hierarchy of integrated yet ontologically distinct categories that bridge the gap between objectivity and subjectivity. Part 1 was about the emergence of the qualitative ascription to the physical. This qualitative ascription evolves due to a generational lineage environment discourse that is facilitated by replication. Part 2 concerned the emergence of the subjective embedded perspective. This spatiotemporal and qualitative worldview emerges due to a real-time experiential discourse that is facilitated by the neural weighting and prioritization of qualitative assimilations. Part 3 was about the revelation for the individual of their own existential being. This is a conceptualized, abstracted worldview that necessitates the identification and recognition of the subjectively experiencing self existing in an objective world. In addition to parts 1 to 3, in the centre of the slide we have the material category, and below that level the quantum ontological category. Clearly I have not incorporated these categories into the presentation. Instead, I have focused only on the biological. On the outer rim beyond part 3 is part 4, or level 4, which has not yet emerged. What is this next novel ontologically distinct category that is yet to emerge from the human condition? It is an area that I am currently working on. Any questions?
Hello, everyone. I'm Adrienne Prettyman. I'm a professor at Bryn Mawr College, and I'm currently recording from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm going to be talking today about diffuse attention, what it is, and why consciousness researchers should be interested in it. So first of all, what is attention? If someone says pay attention, even a little kid knows what to do. They're expected to focus. This idea that attention and focus are deeply intertwined goes back at least to William James, who wrote that everyone knows what attention is. It's the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness, is of its essence. So I've bolded focalization there because that's the claim that I want to question. So I think that James captures a really intuitive notion about attention and its relation to focus, which has been the starting point for a lot of research on attention. But I'm going to try to convince you that this intuitive claim about attention is wrong, and that this has important implications for consciousness research. So to get you thinking about, or to kind of problematize the relationship between attention and focus, I'm going to give you two examples to start. The first example is stargazing. If you want to see the constellations, you might start by focusing on individual stars, but that's not going to get you very far. In order to see the constellations, you have to open up your attention and diffuse it over the night sky so that the patterns emerge. Here's another example. So when you're looking at art, like David's 18th century painting depicting the death of Socrates, you can scrutinize the details of the painting. There's lots of details here, like the expression on Socrates' face, that bowl of hemlock. But you can also diffuse attention over the painting as a whole and appreciate its global properties, like the distribution of light and shadow, or the overall composition of the painting. So when you do this, some of the detail is lost in order for you to appreciate these global properties. Now, I don't mean for these examples to provide an argument for diffuse attention and it's being distinct from focalization. There could be ways of explaining these examples in terms of focus. But what I do hope that these examples do for you is to get you wondering about ways that we might have non-focal but still attentive experiences, like appreciating the balance of light and darkness in this painting, as contrasted with looking at the individual facial expressions. So beyond these examples, is there evidence from, say, psychology, neuroscience, that attention can be diffuse? And I think that the answer is yes. So there are three types of evidence. There's behavioral evidence that diffuse attention enhances certain task performance. There's neurological evidence for distinct neural mechanisms of focal and diffuse attention. And then there's also this phenomenal first-person reports. So here I'm thinking of things like the examples that I just gave you, but also in the phenomenological tradition, there is a very rigorous study of experience that includes things like experiences of a conscious background. And I think that some of those are going to end up being first-person phenomenal evidence for these diffuse but attentive states. This is a short talk, so I'm going to have to be very brief, but you can find lots of details of these studies in this paper that I have forthcoming in Mind and Language, What is Diffuse Attention? So that's where you can find the full story. Taken together, I think that this evidence, the behavioral, neurological, and phenomenal, builds the case for there being diffuse attention. So that there is all of this evidence would be surprising if attention was just equated with focus. Let me start by giving you an example of a model of focal and diffuse attention from the psychological literature. And this figure on the slide is drawn from the psychologist Anne Treisman's work on how attention determines what we see. So she thinks that there are two different ways that we can deploy attention. One is by focusing on a specific stimulus, and the other is by diffusing attention over a group of stimuli. So this figure illustrates how stimuli might be processed and selected by diffuse attention. So first there's the stimuli in the world, and then that oval circles the window of attention. So that is depicting where the subject is attending, in this case, diffusely. So the stimuli are processed visually, but then what the subject sees, what is available to her consciously, is the global object that encompasses all of those stimuli in the window of her attention. So she doesn't see a cross and a cube and a moon. Instead, what she sees is a global object that includes all three of those things. But they might get a little mixed up. So those properties might get mixed up where if the moon is yellow and the cube is not, she might report seeing a yellow cube, but that's not really there. So a global object is a funny kind of object where features are pooled or might even get mixed up. If you think that it is implausible that we experience these kinds of things, I think go out and look at the leaves in a tree or anything that has lots of detail like that. And ask yourself, when you're looking at this tree, do you see each individual leaf? I think probably you don't. But you do see the leaves as a group. And so that's the kind of thing that this is picking out. Each leaf contributes to your experience, but you're not seeing each one individually and like collectively seeing each individual one. You're seeing them as this global object where each leaf is contributing to the properties in that object, but it's not the same as seeing each individual leaf. That would be really overwhelming. So I think this is really common in our ordinary experience, that we see complex stimuli in this pooled way. If this, let's contrast this with the model of focal attention. So here's what you probably thought of when I said, attention was something more like this, where you're focusing in on a stimulus. So in this case, the circle is around, the window of attention is on that crescent moon. And then that's being processed in a way that you will actually see the specific shape bound to that color in a specific location. So it's like you're zeroing in and getting more detail on that object. But if what Treisman has argued, and if what I'm arguing is right, then this is not the only way that you can deploy attention. You can deploy attention to a specific individual, as in focal attention, or you can diffuse it over groups and open a global object file. So these are two different ways of deploying attention on Treisman's view. So far what I've done is I've given you a few reasons to think that attention can be diffuse as well as focal. Attention is sometimes equated with focus, but I've sketched some motivations for positing this non-focal or diffuse attention. Since this is a talk on the philosophical significance of diffuse attention, there's tons more that could be said about diffuse attention itself, but I'm now going to turn to why I think that this debate matters for consciousness researchers. So one reason that it matters is that it has implications for the discussion of attention and consciousness. For about 2 decades now, there's been some optimism about the idea that consciousness might be understood in terms of attention. And early work on this began with the stuff on inattentional blindness from McEnrock and Chabris and Simons. So on the screen is the image from Chabris and Simons' book, The Invisible Gorilla, which if you haven't checked that out, the gorilla experiment, look it up. I won't ruin it for you. So these studies suggested some surprising conclusions about the ways in which attention can affect conscious perception. In short, the inattentional blindness studies suggest that attention might be necessary for consciousness. If you're conscious of something, then you're attending to that thing. So if you're conscious of an object, you're attending to that object. Now, this idea got taken up by philosophers. Jesse Prinz wrote a book called The Conscious Brain, where he argues not just for necessity, but also for sufficiency. So attention is both necessary and sufficient for consciousness, or basically we can understand consciousness in terms of attention. But can attention really explain consciousness? So whenever you see a necessity claim, the first place my brain goes is thinking of counterexamples. So not everyone has been so optimistic. Here's a quote from Bloch from 2013. So he thinks that he's come up with these cases of something called identity crowding, which show that you can have consciousness of some object without attention to that object. And moreover, he thinks that there's evidence for attention in unconscious perception, and so you can get a dissociation between attention and consciousness in both directions. David Rosenthal, 2012, also agrees there's ample evidence of a double dissociation between attention and consciousness. So if these philosophers are correct, then we should give up on trying to understand or explain consciousness in terms of attention, because they can be dissociated. But of course, nobody ever gives up that easily. So the way that philosophers like Jesse Prinz have responded to these counterexamples is to, at least for the cases where you have consciousness without attention, they want to say that diffuse attention can help to explain away some of those cases. So in some cases, attention is focal when we track an object. In other cases, it's diffuse. And so the diffuse attention can explain away some of those counterexamples raised by people like Bloch and Rosenthal. Here's Michael Cohen and Dan Dennett saying something very similar. The world beyond focal attention is not in darkness because when attention is not engaged by a task, it's automatically deployed. The extra resources are automatically deployed elsewhere. So some things are focally attended, others are processed through distributed attention. Okay, that's not the end of the story either, because as David Rosenthal has pointed out, there's something a little fishy about that as a response. So you could say, oh, you're attending somehow, but without independent evidence for attention being deployed in that counterexample, then it's unclear what this claim amounts to. So just saying, oh, maybe you diffusely attend to it isn't really enough. And de Brigard and Prins and Cohen and Dennett, none of them really give much evidence for diffuse attention. So that's part of what my paper on what is diffuse attention is meant to do, is to kind of fill that gap. But we also want to know, in each of these counterexamples that philosophers are pointing to, is there actually evidence of attention, focal or diffuse? Can diffuse attention do the work that it's being asked to do to explain away these counterexamples? So I'm going to look at just two for the sake of time. The first one is this one that I mentioned from Bloch on identity crowding. What's going on here is you're supposed to focus your eyes, just your eyes, direct them to that cross on the left. And then while you keep your eyes perfectly fixed on that cross, shift your attention without moving your eyes to the bars. And try to attend to, let's say, the third bar from the left. Now, I think Bloch's right that that's hard to do. You can't do it. You're not able to actually count the bars while your eyes are held on the cross, and you're not able to attend to each one as its own self-standing object. But even while you have your eyes on the cross, I think Bloch is also right that you have a very robust experience of those bars, and it would be implausible to say that you're not seeing them. It's not like they disappear when you can't attend to them. So you are seeing them, but you can't shift your attention to each one as an object. Now, here's what I want to say to that, is I think that this notion of diffuse attention that I am arguing for is going to help us out in this case. Because although you don't object see the third bar, you do still see it as part of that global object that encompasses the whole figure. And this is something that I argued for in my paper, Seeing the Forest and the Trees. So think back to this diagram that I showed you from Anne Treisman of diffuse attention. What happens is that you get, when the window of attention selects multiple stimuli, you get this kind of global object that has illusory conjunctions where things are represented in a funny way. There's actually evidence that location is represented imprecisely, that things like size and color are pooled rather than represented as distinct objects. So that was from psychologist Aurelie in 2001. So it's a strange kind of representation, but I think that it does the work that we need to explain how it is that you are seeing the bars, but you're seeing them kind of imprecisely, and you're not able to shift attention to each one, but you are seeing them as part of this global object. So what about all of the evidence for a double dissociation that Rosenthal is pointing toward and finds so decisive? Well, there isn't time for me to go through all of them. So I'll just look at one, which is from this paper by Koch and Tsuchiya from 2008 on gist. So they point out that we're always aware of the background, even when we're attending to something focally, even to a very high degree. The rest of the world doesn't disappear. And something like the gist of a scene can be apprehended really quickly. Moreover, it doesn't seem like locally enhancing sections of the scene through focal attention is going to be of any use to apprehending the gist of the scene. So this is pretty strong evidence that when we see a briefly presented scene, we're not deploying focal attention. But do either of these main criticisms in that quote apply to diffuse attention? I think that they don't. So the first one is that the presentation of a gist might be too quick for attention to be deployed. And the second is that enhancing features, like attention seems to do, is no use in gist perception. Let me outline my response very quickly. in response to one, diffuse attention can deploy very quickly. So in the 70s, Navon found that the global processing of a scene occurs very rapidly and precedes local processing, and not just scenes, but also shapes and other types of stimuli. So I think unlike focal, diffuse attention could be deployed at this time scale. Diffuse attention also does not locally enhance features. So it selects the global whole, in this case, the scene. So the second criticism just doesn't apply if we're thinking about diffuse or global selection. Moreover, I wanted to point out that the fact that subjects can remember and report gist suggests that it's selected somehow for cognitive access. And diffuse attention, as I've understood it, can provide us the mechanism for understanding this sort of non-focal selection. So that's just, again, one of the many studies that Rosenthal has pointed to. Why should you care about going through this laundry list of studies and showing that there's an empirically motivated response, that there's evidence for some kind of attention? You should care because it would be a step toward a naturalistic theory of consciousness. And I want to end this presentation by telling you why I think that. So this is the reason that I am interested in this topic in the first place. This is what got me interested in it. And this is a picture of a suspension bridge that I actually crossed. So I kind of love that I'm like hovering above it right now. But that was in, I think it was in Washington State near Mount St. Helens. So totally recommend going across these creepy suspension bridges if you ever have the chance. The bridge argument. Suppose that consciousness can be understood in terms of attention. Suppose further that attention can be understood in terms of neural mechanisms. Then it seems like consciousness can maybe be understood in terms of neural mechanisms. So if 1 and 2 can be established, then attention could serve as an explanatory bridge between the physical and the phenomenal mind. Now I think that diffuse attention makes that first claim more plausible because it addresses counterexamples, though I've only gone through a couple. But I think there's lots more that it can help us to address. And therefore, diffuse attention helps us make the case for this naturalistic explanation of consciousness in terms of attention. Now, a couple of things to just note that I have not addressed about this argument. I only talked about the first claim. How plausible is 2? Maybe you have a theory of attention, but it's not so straightforward that that could be understood in terms of its neural mechanisms. But superficially, I think it is fairly plausible that whatever our cognitive theory of attention might be, we'll also be able to eventually understand how it is neurally implemented. To borrow Chalmers' terminology, it seems to me like one of the easy problems, though of course not that easy. Second, is understanding transitive in the way that this argument requires? So I think sometimes it is. If heat is molecular motion, or can be understood in terms of molecular motion, and molecular motion can be understood in terms of physics, then heat can be understood in terms of physics. But I do wonder, is this always going to be, is understanding always transitive in the way that this argument requires? So those are some things that I'm thinking about. To just quickly sum up, the view that attention is necessary for consciousness is subject to tons of counterexamples, and diffuse attention helps us to explain away many of those counterexamples. Moreover, there's robust evidence for diffuse attention. And this whole debate contributes toward an understanding of the physical basis of consciousness via the bridge argument. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope to hear your questions by email or virtually. So bye.
Hello, this is David Murphy speaking to you from Kirksville, Missouri, and try to get my share going here. Hope we're set. Here we have the title of my piece. I want to include this epigraph by David Chalmers, of course, an enormous figure within consciousness studies, to indicate the constructive purpose of my paper. This piece will be polemically focused, but I do share the broader explanatory quest. Here's my overall question. Hope to take that up over time. I can only take up fragments of that here. Very dense screen, partly blocked. I don't know how to unblock it there, but this conveys a very brief sense of the discussion that I use as a point of reference. I'll return to a couple summaries later. And here, in short, is my argument, especially that last bit: explanationists need not abandon their advocacy due to the kind of internal critique suggested by Spivak. Pluralist explanationism suggests a promising path forward. There are a number of preliminaries that I need to provide, saying what explanationism is. It's one crucial one, and I draw from a kind of minimalist description by Peter Lipton, who can be taken as a paradigmatic explanationist. Another preliminary part, what is the extended mind? Andy Clark and David Chalmers are co-inventors. There is the extended mind, and then there's a more modest version. So there's Heck and Hemp described there on the screen. The first making a constitutive claim, the second merely a causal claim. What does this have to do with the ontology of consciousness, the focus of our session? All that's debated. There are plenty of folks, including Elva Noe, who want to extend the extended mind hypothesis to consciousness. Strikingly, Clark and Chalmers themselves resist this extension. To return to the targeted discussion, I say there are three prongs. The first has to do with a question raised by Peter Lipton upon hearing a lecture by Andy Clark in which he's providing examples that is to lead to belief in Heck. And Lipton asked, what difference would it make if environmental features were cognitive or mental? And neither he nor Mark Spivak, his student, colleague, and friend, were able to see such a difference. Secondly, there's a broad question regarding explanation, harkening back to the statement by Chalmers that I used as epigraph. Does the appeal to explanation in general work for or against Heck or Hemp, for that matter? And then thirdly, Spivak develops Lipton's originating question in terms of inference of the best explanation, a particular version thereof. I would contend that it's helpful to differentiate the prongs as they're discussed. I don't think the same response works in each case. So another important ingredient is what's meant by inference of the best explanation. That proves to be a tangled issue, I would argue, with a lot of variants out there, but I begin with the version presented by Mark Spivak as he draws from something said by Peter Lipton. So here I point out that there are these variants, a lot of them having to do with the way in which inference to the best explanation is thought to track truth. And I contend that Lipton's work is especially valuable in looking at various characteristics and versions of inference to the best explanation. In order to get the summary of the targeted piece correct, I want to cite the author directly. Notably, he says there, a serious rival to Heck exists. namely Hemp, and this invalidates IBEs for both the truth and falsity of Heck. Explanatory evaluated cognitive science is not a guide to the truth value of Heck. I agree with Mark in part. I think that he makes a strong case within the way that he frames the argument. However, the worry right up front is to what extent does his framing capture the explanatory ruminations of Chalmers among others, and I would argue that in the piece that Sprivik himself cites, Chalmers doesn't fit neatly, at least within the umbrella that Sprivik lays it out. Another summarizing move, I say that you can identify kind of internal critique at the core of Sprivik's argument. He's saying that advocates as well as opponents of Heck appeal to inference to the best explanation. However, when you examine inference to the best explanation carefully and look at the call for examination of rivals and, as he puts it, the need for a clear victor to emerge, well, the appeal that advocates of Heck are using actually proves to be the undoing of their argument. So I'm wondering whether advocates or critics of Heck and Hemp really need to adopt the strategy that Sprivik proposes. And I argue that there are a range of tools and resources within explanationism that may well lead in a different direction, different conclusions. So one remark is one could go far afield in attempting to undo this internal critique. I cite there a remark by Paul Feyerabend concerning inference to the best explanation. I'm going to stick closely to the work of Peter Lipton, things that he endorses or sympathetically describes or at least points to. And in that way, I hope to soften or dissolve the internal critique from within. So I hope to broaden the scope of investigation by considering a range of tools and resources within explanationism and more specifically within inference of the best explanation. I'm going to do that in a series of moves. One kind of radical move maybe is drawn from Lipton's own work, where he suggests that there might be a constructive empiricist version of inference to the best explanation, briefly described there on the screen. Then I ask, well, what would be the pertinence of this? Well, a constructive empiricist inference to the best explanation would contest the terms of the argument as set by Sprivik. You'd go in a really different direction. One outcome might be a more friendly take on the possibility of being agnostic with respect to Heck and Hemp. In the same ballpark, still looking at Lipton's magnum opus, inference to the best explanation, he talks about ranking, briefly described there again as he attempts to make overtures to anti-realist Bas van Fraassen. What might that have to do with the discussion? Well, Sprivik says that perhaps there are some differences, but IBE requires that there is a clear winner. But under the ranking model, you'd want to look very closely at the relations of various explanatory virtues, and perhaps some meaningful, significant ranking could be generated even if no clear winner emerged. Thirdly, I briefly introduce abduction as a form of IBE, at least according to some. Cheryl Spreevik, for instance, and I ask what that might have to do with the discussion. Mark says that the race is too close to call, and it makes a pretty strong claim here. It's hard to see how future evidence could settle it. And in thinking about this issue, the application of abduction to the debate, I introduce the extended conscious mind. So Clark describes it by differentiating the extended mind that he and Chalmers back, and then comparing it with the extended conscious mind. Both Chalmers and Clark are critical of the extended conscious mind, as mentioned. What does that have to do with my presentation? Well, I'm asserting that this explanationist tool of abduction might be applicable because it looks to me like the arguments by Chalmers and Clark could be rendered in abductive form as counter hypotheses to the extended conscious mind hypothesis. Next, I introduce the theme of contrastive explanation that features very heavily in Lipton's work, also in his main book, Inference to the Best Explanation. And he links it with interest relativity. I give a particular example of it as Lipton describes our theme for the day, consciousness. He's reviewing a number of proposals, and it seems like there's massive confusion and inconsistency and maybe contradiction. He says, well, some of that can be sorted out with the tool of contrastive explanation. And he asserts that maybe in some cases, apparently incompatible answers are really different, but compatible answers to different questions. And as he discusses the theme of consciousness and contrastive explanation, he draws a connection with what he calls explanatory pluralism. And that phrasing, it influences me in speaking of explanationist pluralism. Interim question here, an uncomfortable question. Well, why am I talking about Lipton so much? Because doesn't his what difference challenge undo the kind of argument that I'm trying to make? And provisional inadequate response here is that Lipton's work is rich and multifaceted, suggesting various directions that one might take. I regard revision suggested by Chalmers as the most promising position to consider. That response comes after Peter Lipton's sudden and tragic death. And I would suggest delicately that we don't know for sure how he might have responded to that proposal. We do know that Spreevik is critical to the essay in which Chalmers makes the revision. Can report for myself as a pluralist explanationist, much influenced by Lipton, and I see a lot of merit to Chalmers' revision. And I think that my sense is fueled by various themes within Lipton's work, as well as appeals that he makes to preceding sources. So there's lot more explaining that I should do concerning the example of Otto and his notebook featured in Clark and Chalmers' original extended mind essay. There's a ton of debate about that essay and this particular example, and in reviewing the essay 10 years later, Chalmers suggests maybe we shouldn't be afraid of a little revisionism, and perhaps in response to criticism, we can draw a distinction between focusing on why does Otto reach for the notebook, in which case maybe we should concede that, well, there doesn't seem to be an extended belief. Hemp works perfectly well there. But for other explanatory purposes, when thinking about Otto, it does make sense to invoke Heck. So Chalmers is saying, well, depending on the interest that one has, or this is how I read him, one is going to focus on different questions, and those are going to have somewhat different answers, but they're compatible with each other, and each answer has application within a different context. Sprivik is not enthusiastic about this kind of move. He focuses more on a comment made by Clark in the ballpark of going between different explanations. He worries that there's a loss of tracking the truth and that explanatory properties are toothless. So there's a lot of sorting out to be done, including thinking through the reference by Lipton multiple times to the work of Bus van Fraassen and Alan Garfinkel on this topic, and how he makes their discussions of contrastive explanation his own. And he revises the theme in a distinctive way by talking about the difference condition. And I think that it's that theme in Lipton that shapes his question to Clark. So there's a lot of sorting out, but it does seem premature to dismiss the kind of revision made by Chalmers. It looks quite interesting from a pluralist explanationist vantage point. Finally, a massive theme I'm going to very quickly introduce in reviewing the work of Bas van Fraassen, a great critic of inference of the best explanation. Lipton says at the end of his 10-page essay that he finds himself being a pluralist without being able to articulate even quite what that is. Lipton is not relinquishing his explanationism, so it looks like he exemplifies a combination of voluntarism and explanationism, a super intriguing possibility to me, but one where we're bereft of Peter's elaboration. What might this have to do with Heck and Hemp? Well, it's to be determined, but again, under voluntarist explanationism or explanationist voluntarism, it looks like the explanationist would move in a rather different direction than Sprivik, or at least would resist his framing of the issues. This brings me to my conclusion. Turning toward the end there, it'd be premature to call a stalemate with respect to explanatory considerations, and such explanatory considerations may yet be established as significant or even decisive within a pluralist explanationist framework. In small print, the things that I cited, and thank you for your attention.
Hello. My name is Luis Favela. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy and cognitive sciences at the University of Central Florida. Thanks for checking out my talk titled Extended Cognition, Yes. Extended Consciousness, No. So the main claim of this talk is that although there are compelling reasons to accept the existence of extended cognition, the same is not true for extended consciousness. I'll start out by explaining what the extended cognition thesis is, then what the extended consciousness thesis is, then what affordances are and how they are purported to support the existence of extended consciousness, and then I'll discuss two criticisms of extended consciousness. So what is the extended cognition thesis, or ECOG for short? ECOG is the idea that cognitive systems can incorporate features of the world whose locations are beyond what is typically understood to be the boundaries of an organism, such as its exoskeleton, fur, or skin. With ECOG, cognitive tasks, such as decision-making, perception, prospection, etc., are at times both causally related to features outside the organism, such as ambient light, and constituted by such components, for example, using a stick to augment one's perceptual capabilities. It's important to understand that causally refers to a cause-effect relationship, whereas constituted means that something is actually made up of something. Why should we believe that the extended cognition thesis is true? Well, actually, there's a lot of good reasons to believe in ECOG. For a review, see the following two articles listed in the references. I'd like to go over a few key examples that provide support for the existence of ECOG. First comes from the analytic philosophy tradition, the example of Inga and Otto, who are both interested in going to see a movie. When Inga has to think about how she's going to get to the movie, she remembers the directions. That information is stored in her neurons, her hippocampus. She accesses that information there. Otto, on the other hand, has some memory deficits, and although he has a hard time accessing memories from his brain, he stores memories or information in a notebook. And so when he wants to go see a movie at the theater, he looks up in his notebook the directions to get to the theater. And so in that way, people like Clark and Chalmers have argued that the notebook that Otto uses to access information and the neurons Inga uses to access information are playing the same functional role. And so in that way, they should both be treated as part of their memory systems. Even though one is inside the person, inside Inga's head, and the other one is outside the person in the notebook for Otto. But there's also examples of support for extended cognition from the phenomenology tradition. Merleau-Ponty, a classical phenomenologist, discusses the experience that a visually impaired person has using a cane. And if you were to ask that person what it's like, they wouldn't tell you, oh, when I'm using my cane to feel the world, I feel the cane feeling the world. No, they just say, I feel the world. In that way, the phenomenological description reveals that the cane has become an extended part of their perceptual capabilities. There are also more scientific or empirical approaches to extended cognition. There's some work in sensory substitution literature. Sensory substitution devices are tools that are used to substitute one sense for another. In this case, we have a haptic device, so a device that's based on touch, that's placed on the torso of an individual. That device has little pins that provide stimulation to the torso. Those pins correspond to pixels on the camera that the person is wearing, such that whatever is detected by the camera translates to information that is felt on the torso with the metal plate with the pins. So in that way, the perceptual system has extended from just being in the eyes to being on other parts of the body and incorporating these tools. In my own work, laboratory work, we've used sensory substitution devices to allow people who are not using sight to use touch to navigate obstacles and make decisions about whether or not they can pass through apertures. So in that way, this tool has extended their ability to perceive beyond just what's inside their body periphery. So these examples are intended to motivate the idea that extended cognition is an idea that has popped up in a lot of different literatures, from analytic philosophy to phenomenology to scientific and experiments. But what about extended consciousness? Some have argued that if cognition is extended, perhaps consciousness is extended as well. Here, consciousness refers to an intuitive sense in which states of a system have subjective phenomenal character. Or, as Thomas Nagel puts it, the what it is like. A conscious state is what it is like for an organism to be that organism. So what is the extended cognition thesis, or econ? Conscious states, everything from feeling fear in your gut to seeing the redness of an apple, are at times both causally related to features outside the world, such as experiencing heat in the hand that is near a hot stove, and constituted by such components in the world. When it comes to examples of components outside the world that constitute conscious states, it's a little bit more difficult to find. But one example that's given in recent literature is affordances. Affordances originated in ecological psychology. This work was done by James Gibson and colleagues in the mid-20th century. It originated as a theory of perception and action, where the idea was that the unit of investigation when understanding psychological phenomena like perception and action is the entire organism environment system. So in order to understand flight, for example, it's not going to do to just pay attention to the features of the bird, the feathers, the wings, etc. But to totally understand flight, one needs to understand the medium in which the bird is conducting flight. So the organism environment system becomes the unit of investigation. Gibson and ecological psychology is probably most well known for the idea of affordances. Affordances, in short, are opportunities for behavior. These opportunities are based on properties of both the environment and the organism. An example of an organism property is a mammalian's visual system. An example of an environmental property would be ambient light. Affordances are understood as emerging at the level of the organism environment system, at the level at which the organism and environment interact. Affordances are understood as being objective, in the sense that they're based on features that are objectively in the environment, for example, an optic array. But affordances are also understood as being subjective in that they are based on features of the organism, for example, the particular light wavelengths that an organism can perceive. Examples of affordances include the affordance graspable, such as a doorknob that someone can fit their hand around. Step overable, such as a gap that a person with a particular leg length could step over. And hammer withable, whether a hammer has its head attached to its handle or not. Affordances have an interesting metaphysics that's been discussed in the literature. The idea is that the existence of affordances allows us to think about dissolving notions of subjective, objective dichotomies in matters of cognition. Because affordances seem to be properties that are neither totally objective nor totally subjective. A famous or infamous quote from Gibson that points this out is as follows: "An affordance is neither an objective property nor a subjective property, or it is both, if you like. An affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective-objective and helps us to understand its inadequacy. It is equally a fact of the environment and a fact of behavior. It is both physical and psychical, yet neither. An affordance points both ways, to the environment and to the observer." These key phrases have motivated people to think that perhaps affordances give us a way of dissolving certain dualisms. Certainly dualisms in perception and action, so the idea that perception is distinct from action, but in terms of consciousness, it has also motivated the idea that consciousness is not something that is just within the organism, but perhaps outside the organism as well. Silberstein and Chimero have made some of the more popular and recent arguments in support of extended consciousness. Here are a couple of key statements from them. If, quote, you believe that cognitive systems include portions of the extraneural, extra-bodily environment, so if you believe in extended cognition, basically, quote, you probably should also believe that consciousness includes portions of the extraneural, extra-bodily environment. They go on to state, pointing out the role of affordances, that the animal's behavioral niche, the set of affordances that it has learned to perceive and act upon, just as the environment as the animal experiences it. This underwrites a variety of phenomenological realism, according to which the entire system, including the environment as experienced, is required to account for phenomenology cognition. Conscious experience on this view is not nothing but the activity of a brain. It is inseparable from cognition, which is the ongoing activity of a nervous system, body, and niche, non-linearly coupled to one another. In short, what Silberstein and Chimero and other proponents of extended consciousness are saying, in terms of affordances, is as follows. If cognition involves affordances, and if affordances are realized in organism environment systems that cut across subjective-objective boundaries, then consciousness also cuts across subjective-objective boundaries. Here, people like Silberstein and Chimero argue that consciousness and cognition are deeply connected. Thus, if one extends, so does the other. I'd like to point out a couple criticisms of belief in the existence of extended consciousness. My main claim, again, is that although there are compelling reasons to accept the existence of extended cognition, the same is not true for extended consciousness. To believe in either, both need to show that they are causally and constitutively related to features outside the organism periphery. Again, causal is a cause-effect relationship, where an apple in the world causes you to see an apple. That's trivially true. But a constitutive relationship is much stronger. For example, if you have a Lego castle, the little Legos that build up and make up that castle constitute the castle. My main aim in this talk is not to defend the idea that extended cognition exists. I'm just going to accept that claim right now. I think that there are compelling arguments and empirical data to support the idea that cognition is both causally and constitutively related to features outside the organism periphery. What I do want to argue in more depth is that extended consciousness does not exist. I don't think that there are compelling arguments or empirical data to support the claim that consciousness is both causally and constitutively related to features outside the organism periphery. There are two arguments I'd like to make. First, the argument from affordances. Conscious experiences of affordances are causally related to features outside the organism periphery. This, again, is trivially true. Visual experiences are causally related to ambient energy in the optic array. But conscious experiences of affordances are not constituted by features outside the organism periphery. In fact, organisms are not consciously aware of many, perhaps most affordances, nor do they need to be. For example, attention is not needed for affordance selection. Non-consciously aware stimulus information can be utilized in affordance selection. And affordances automatically evoke motor responses without executive control. So the bottom line here is that if affordances are a key way of supporting the idea for extended consciousness, they don't seem to be a very strong reason to, because affordances can be utilized without any sort of conscious experience that accompanies them. The second argument against the existence of extended consciousness comes from realization. First, according to our best science, consciousness is realized in neuronal systems. That's to say that consciousness is constituted by brain states. Two, consciousness is causally related to. For example, it receives information from features outside its realization base, that is, outside its neuronal systems, such as body states, pain in a foot after stepping on a nail, end states of the world, visual experience of a red apple on a nearby table. One kind of constitutive relationship is exhibited by systems with integrated information. That is to say that a system, or what counts as a system, is constituted by the information that integrates to such a degree that the realizers of that information exhibit global mutual cause-effect relationships. In other words, something can be understood as being a system if, when it integrates information, the effect that the integration of that information has reverberates or has cause-effect consequences throughout the whole system. Conscious systems are integrated information systems. I refer readers to the integrated information theory originating with Giulio Tononi. 5. Conscious states, qua neuronal states, only observe such global mutual cause-effect relationships with other conscious states, qua neuronal states, meaning that conscious states only have that tightly coupled, strongly cause-effect relationship with other conscious states. And since conscious states are neuronal states, it is just like saying that neuronal states have that tightly coupled cause-effect relationship with other neuronal states. Therefore, non-neuronal states do not constitute conscious states. That is, non-neuronal features of the body and world do not constitute consciousness, even if they're causally related. And if that's true, then 7, extended consciousness does not exist. Here's an example of what this argument is saying from realization. Consider the perception of a face. The perception of a face can be thought of when we look at the figure labeled B by being comprised of lips, a nose, and eyes. But when someone perceives a face, they don't perceive them as distinct parts. They perceive them as an integrated whole. And when any part of that whole changes, the whole changes. If the perception of the eye is moving, it does not seem like it is isolated. What this is getting at is a type of gestalt sense of consciousness. What do I mean by gestalt sense of consciousness? Consider this other example. Consciousness is such that the whole experience changes and affects each other. So in this picture, on the figure on the right, you might not notice what it is. It might just look like a bunch of black dots. But once you realize that it's a Dalmatian sniffing the ground, the whole image changes. The whole image becomes a whole different conscious experience. You've had the same information, but it's been integrated in a new way. And that new way has changed the whole meaning and the whole experience. So in that way, conscious systems are realized in systems that have a integrated information. In conclusion, I discussed the extended cognition thesis, or ECOG, which is the idea that components outside of what is typically considered the periphery of an organism contribute to and constitute cognition. Discuss the extended consciousness thesis, or the idea that consciousness also extends beyond the periphery of organisms in both a causal and constitutive way. Discussed 2 criticisms of extended consciousness, one based on affordances. I argued that whereas defenders of extended consciousness think that affordances provide a way to understand how consciousness extends, I argued that, in fact, They don't, because affordances are not always consciously perceived, among other reasons. And the second criticism of extended consciousness comes from the realization of those conscious states, in that the realization of a conscious state, what is constituting that system, does not extend outside the neuronal system that realizes conscious experiences. And so my main claim has been, although there are compelling reasons to accept the existence of extended cognition, the same is not true for extended consciousness. Here are references, which I'll provide in a separate document as well. And I'm happy to accept questions and comments. You can email me or check out my website. Thank you for your time. Goodbye.